AI is changing the world in which we live. AI is changing the world that our students are entering. AI is changing the world in which we work. If you envision a paradise, show me the policy to get there. People don't start learning about it now, that 5 years is going to creep up, and we're maybe still going to be talking about chatbots while the rest of the world will have gone to that next phase.
In this episode, we're excited to welcome Professor Mairéad Pratschke. Professor Pratschke is an internationally recognized authority in digital education and AI, with more than 25 years of experience at the intersection of digital technology, education, and learning innovation. She's a visiting professor at the LSE Data Science Institute. She also sits on the advisory board of the National AI Institute for Adult Learning and Online Education, which is funded by the National Science Foundation. And she's an advisor to the government of Portugal's National Council on Pedagogical Innovation in Higher Education. An influential scholar, Professor Pratschke's recent publications greatly advance the field's understanding of AI in education. Her 2024 book, Generative AI in Education, Digital Pedagogies, Teaching Innovation and Learning Design, explores the integration of generative AI into teaching and learning, and she also authored New Horizons for Higher Education, a report examining emerging AI capabilities, pedagogical innovations, and the institutional strategies necessary to adapt to the AI-driven world. Recently, she published From AI Tools to AI Systems, Designing Pedagogical Systems for Learning. Her vision for the future of learning is one of collaboration between humans and intelligent machines. She encourages institutions and educators to embrace AI, not just as an automation tool, but as a creative collaborator that can empower learners for a rapidly changing AI-driven society. We hope you enjoy this conversation with Professor Mairéad Pratschke. Welcome, Dr. Pratschke. We're so excited to have you here, and we have a lot of questions to ask, so we'll just jump right in. I want to start with one talking a bit about the model for higher ed, the university model. Traditionally, universities have developed human intelligence through content mastery and helping students learn to think through ideas, developing important skills such as writing, of course, as a way of thinking. With AI now competing in these areas, how do you see this challenging the role of the university, and what does it do to the economic value of a higher ed degree?
Interestingly, I don't think it challenges the role of the university at all. I think it changes the role of the university, or maybe it highlights the fact that the purpose of education is dependent on who you talk to. So some people believe that higher education and universities in particular are places that you go to learn how to think critically, think differently about the world, maybe develop as a human being, grow up if you go as an 18 or a 19-year-old. Other people think of higher education as a place to prepare for work, and that it's very much about employability and skills development. And for some reason, those two don't always cross over and talk to each other. There seems to be a bit of a split. And I think from my perspective, this is the conversation that I'm seeing being pushed now into the center. One of the many being pushed into the center is, what is the purpose of higher education today? And once we and if we can answer that question, then what is it that we need to teach? How do we teach it is secondary, really, but what do we need to teach? How do we teach it? Why do we teach it? But if we, it's really the big existential questions I think that we're at now. So AI clearly is a challenge to higher education in terms of the traditional model. I am not a subscriber, though, to this line that, universities and colleges haven't changed since the 19th century, that all we do is stand on a stage and lecture. That anyone who says things like that simply hasn't been to a university recently. That's just not what happens. So I think that's a very easy way to target some less than excellent teaching, but it definitely doesn't reflect the reality of the people I've worked with over the last 20 or so years. So I think it's really more that it's forcing us to address things that haven't worked, that have become stale, and really look at where education can benefit from this new technology. And particularly, I think we can talk about this later, but this is really when you're thinking about things like accessibility, scale, global access to education. If you're looking at it from a different perspective, maybe the criticism or the applause for AI might change significantly. Yeah.
You raised a lot of, interesting questions, right? That higher education needs to consider, whether it's its purpose or, changing maybe some of the content, right, that students are learning and how they're learning it, and these different questions, that arise. And, the AI companies are kind of like, putting their foot on the gas pedal and like, going as fast as possible. We see like, 200,000 GPU data center being built in Tennessee, one being built the size of Manhattan, rolling out these, what they call Socratic tutors as fast as they can. Whereas, higher ed, in education in general, it's like very, very deliberative, which is good, right? We don't want to just kind of make change too quickly. But it seems that kind of there's developing like some tension for the rate of change in AI, which, is kind of coming after knowledge work and, the rate of change in education, including higher education. Do you have any suggestions for, not really putting the foot on the gas and going as fast as possible, but some things that education might be able to do to, accelerate its traditional processing?
Well, I mean, that's a huge question. How might education accelerate its traditional process? I don't know if I'm qualified necessarily to answer that, but I'll address it like insofar as we're talking about AI and the bridge and the gap maybe between the pace of AI development and the processes that govern the timelines in higher ed. I will tell you, like I'm Irish, grew up in Europe and then emigrated to North America. So I spent a lot of time in Canada and I've lived in the US as well. And even there, the context is completely different. So the first thing is that it depends on where you are, what your reality is. The role of the instructor and the amount of agency they have and what they have the power to change even or experiment with or tools they can use differs depending on what country you're in. And that's tied to the geopolitics of AI. Whether you're in China or the US, you're going to have access to different systems, right? Whether you're in the EU, you're in Canada, you're going to be working under different regulatory systems. So that's the first thing maybe to mention is that, and this is why I wrote the paper I just put out today, context, I think, is key. And context is so, so important. First of all, there is no universal answer. But the one I would say that the answer I would give to people in education that are worried and feel this gap in terms of the pace of change between education as we understand it now and the AI companies, the first thing I would say is stop thinking about AI as edtech. Stop thinking about AI as edtech. I don't look at AI as edtech at all. I look at AI as a transformative general purpose technology in the same way that we talk about the internet and electricity. And I think the conversation about AI has been co-opted and taken over. And it started in the very early days, late 2022, 2023. All of the wrapper tools that came onto the market that were being pushed into education, particularly K-12, really, I think, gave educators the wrong idea about what AI is. And they just assumed this was the latest edtech product. And of course, for good reason, because AI has also changed the digital ecosystem into an AI ecosystem. And I talk about that in my book. It's one of the chapters. But I think we actually have to step back and realize AI is not edtech. Edtech is just a sector that is using AI, just like every sector is using AI. And the fundamental opportunity for educators, for administrators, for learners is learn how to use the technology. It is as simple as that. Get in there, start playing around with the tools, open up things like AI makerspaces, get some subscriptions or use some open source models. Just start playing with the technology and start breaking down the boundaries and the barriers to understanding. Because that, I think, is the biggest thing, is that a lot of people just fundamentally don't even understand what the technology is about. And they're so used to taking their narrative from other places that I think that we just haven't kind of taken a breath. And that's because of the pace too. But we haven't taken a breath and looked at it and said, wait a second, actually, maybe this could be great. Maybe this could be great. But if so, we need to own some of that narrative and decide how we want to proceed.
That's a really fascinating point about how the framing of the technology and understanding the way we label the technology really changes how we approach it. What I wanted to ask you a little bit about is, of course, it's not monolithic in the sense that all higher ed is the same, but one fairly common characteristic, if anybody's been through a faculty meeting or faculty governance, is that we do move fairly slowly and fairly methodically, and for good reason. In the past, when we're reflecting on curricular changes or thinking about gen ed revision, it usually takes years. In this case, there's a concern that maybe universities just aren't nimble enough to reinvent themselves for an AI age. And so, given the way you just talked about reframing it, it's not just ed tech. This is a transformative technology that is permeating society. Part of it is the internal use, but also thinking about how do we better prepare as higher ed professionals, our students, for an AI world. Do you think that higher ed has a chance that we're nimble enough to be able to make that shift? Or maybe will new educational models emerge from this? If that happens, then does higher ed kind of go away? Does it transform? How do you see this playing out over the next 5 to 10 years?
I don't think higher ed goes away, but I think it very likely transforms. I'm already seeing some indications that it might very well split into kind of two main sectors. One where they do really make the most of the tools and the technology. And we'll see this probably first in online only, though there's also a bigger threat to online in terms of assessment. So it's a kind of, again, it's a two-sided coin. But I could very much see where can we scale easily with AI and attract students maybe with the same branding, but a slightly different platform or different offering compared to universities where maybe they want to keep the face-to-face. Maybe they want to actually leverage the fact that it's small, in-person, intimate, gatherings with your tutor, for example, very much like the old Oxbridge model. I also relatedly think the role of the educator itself is bifurcating, and there are choices there too. Do you want to be an educator, designer, builder of tools and apps, for example, now as we're getting into this agentic age? Or do you want to be more the kind of counselor, mentor, emotional support type teacher role, very much the kind of cliche of who the teacher is? And I'll tell you, as someone who taught for quite a long time, I didn't do a PhD because I wanted to be a counselor. I did a PhD because I was interested in my topic. So I think that's going to be kind of a troublesome one too, but we'll see where it leads. But back to your question about, are they nimble enough? Clearly, as they are now, no, because we're looking at the same conversations we had 3 years ago almost, which is shocking. So no, they're not nimble enough. Yes, they have to change their processes. But back to what I said about how AI is changing everything, and you just referred to it in your question too. Again, back to the narrative about AI being an edtech thing, it's not. And I think if we step back from that, then we actually can give ourselves a chance to see what the real opportunity is. And that is that AI is changing the world in which we live. AI is changing the world that our students are entering. AI is changing the world in which we work. So yes, we have to talk about whether or not we use tutors or how we assess or all of that, but actually the much bigger, maybe that's the real existential question, is how is the world changing because now we have AI everywhere? And I think, again, it almost feels like in education, we've put ourselves into this very narrow little category with this conversation. Whereas we really, as pedagogues, as disciplinary experts, as people who think for a living, we have the opportunity to open this much more and have a much more wide-ranging discussion.
If you were the president, or maybe on the academic side, more appropriately, the provost or so of the university, right? And you kind of had also some resources, right? Because clearly universities around the world, or at least in the West, are really struggling with resources, right? So imagining that you're the provost and you have some resources, maybe you receive some support for a center like Anand, right? And you have these resources. One of the things you mentioned was, okay, just experiment with the tools, right? So you could make some tools available to faculty. Like what are some other things you might encourage them to do, right? Like maybe try some different types of things in class, or offer a class as a department, or try some different ways of teaching. Like what are maybe a few things that come to your mind that you might encourage?
So many things. So thanks for asking, first of all. So first of all, the last page of my book says exactly where I want people to start. And it includes things like you've just mentioned. I've included things like create a community of practice, give people access to a wide variety of tools. I don't think I used the phrase AI makerspace, but I think that is one of the obvious opportunities, is create an AI makerspace where you'll have a couple of mentors. They could be other students, they could be PhD students, have a drop-in place, a section in the library, whatever you want, where people can go and just play in the same way that you play in a makerspace with, VR headsets and 3D printing and all of that stuff. In fact, it could be the same place. So that's one thing I would very clearly start with, but that also requires a bit of budget. The other thing, clearly, community of practice for educators, because even though the conversation is much more now advanced than it was 2 years ago, I do think a lot of educators are still quite nervous about how unprepared they are. And they do feel vulnerable, and rightly so, because students are ahead of them. Because again, students are the ones who, I think, a lot of us talk about this when we talk about it online and various fora together, but students don't even see AI as a strange alien thing anymore. It's just one of the many tools that they use. It's integrated into everything they already use. So they're miles ahead, but they still need to learn how to use it ethically and carefully and responsibly. So that's an area where professors and lecturers can help. So AI makerspace, community of practice. Back to your question, though, about resources. This is actually the main one because, you know, I said earlier, it depends on your context. It depends on how much money you have. It also depends on the geopolitics. It depends on your location. It depends on what your government allows. So be brave, experiment, put whatever resources you have there, and get those people that are interested and motivated and eager, ask them to dedicate a little bit of their time, but then go straight to your, not just the provost, go to your VC and let them know that these people need compensation, either in terms of maybe not financial, but maybe a little bit of teaching load lightening, maybe some kind of, some kind of acknowledgement in terms of just shout outs or awards or whatever it is that you want to do, but some kind of an acknowledgement for the unpaid work that educators do and have been doing for years on this front.
Well, that's the perfect segue to what I wanted to talk about next, and that is for the instructors, the professors on the front lines. You know, I have a lot of sympathy for my colleagues that are just overwhelmed by the challenges presented by AI, and I understand the initial reaction, especially 3 years ago, by ignoring or banning it, to saying it's an AI-free zone. We're obviously well past that. How would you advise, and you've talked about a couple of points already, but for those faculty that are already doing so much work in terms of keeping up with their classes without even considering AI, how do they adapt? What new approaches, and maybe start with faculty that haven't had a chance to really delve into the topic and really understand the use of AI. What are the first steps, and then maybe where do they go from there?
They need support and they need a little bit of time. So because they don't get a lot of time and they probably won't get financial support, we have to use what's freely available first. The good news in being a bit late to the game is that there are billions of free resources out there. You could take them. There's lots of platforms that offer them. There's also, if you're more techie or technically inclined, you could go onto Andrew Ng's deep learning site. That's a great one, I think, for learning about things like agents and RAG and how you build things. But also just generally, just go and watch some of the free stuff on YouTube. I mean, there's nothing stopping people from learning the basics of AI. I think the real issue is figuring out who you trust, figuring out who your trusted voices are, because there are an awful lot of AI influencers out there as well. So make sure you find a few trusted voices. So use the free stuff, get support from your leaders, try to build some time, share resources, create a community of practice so you share the load. And that all very much ties to those spaces where you can experiment and play and learn new things together.
Thanks for that. I wanted to follow, the one other thing I wanted to note that you said, that's one thing I noticed when I first got involved in this, that there wasn't leadership either from K-12 administration or from university administration. I got connected to all these professors who, were really interested, or, people in K-12, a lot of them were edtech folks, but there were some others that were really kind of taking this initiative on their own. And I hope we look back and really give those people a lot of credit, not just now for the things they're doing, but they're kind of the ones that instigated a lot of things. The question I have too is, we talked about, what leadership can do, and we're starting to see that emerge, but still in a slow process, I think. Ready to see the faculty. We have students who are entering university right this fall. My son's one of them. He'll be a freshman. The other one graduated. But I wonder what advice you might give to students who are entering, because they're starting to see the maybe not existential side of the university, but of their own, financial futures, right? And I wonder, or just kind of how to navigate, right? They had dealt with that a little bit at K-12, a teacher who would get mad or didn't really know about AI, but now they're going into this whole new environment. So I'm wondering, at least, they see it as just completely divorced from what already happened. So I'm wondering what advice you might give them.
Well, in terms of how they should navigate it at their institution, honestly, I think by now pretty much every higher ed institution will have guidance, if not a policy. I don't even necessarily think policies are a great idea because you keep having to change them, but definitely guidance, So hopefully that's a given. And if not, I would be pushing very strongly and just saying to my professor or program director or head of department, give us some guidance. I don't think I would even leave it to the students to have to sort that one out, to be honest with you. In terms of, I'm not sure whether you were talking about the navigation with AI in their courses, or in terms of things like where are they going to go in the world with
Yeah,
AI?
I mean, but I guess it was a little bit of both. I
Okay.
should have been a little more specific. How do you kind of navigate this in your university? But, looking forward, right? Like, how might you want to think about this in, at least a somewhat positive way, right? Like, not view it so existential. And how might you take advantage of kind of the university the way it's configured now? It's not going to change much in the next year, right? Like, how might you take advantage of what is generally available in universities? Of course, with some context in mind, but generally, what might you take advantage of your upcoming education to best prepare yourself for kind of an unknown world?
Listen, I mean, this is the joy and the amazing thing about being in university. You are exposed to all of these people with deep, deep knowledge, expertise. You're exposed to groups of students and professors and extracurricular groups that you wouldn't have been part of before. You can join clubs and do things that you'll probably never do again in your life if you don't do them in this few years or maybe the decade to follow. I would say, and also you can get funded for things like internships. You can do study years abroad. You can apply for scholarships or for bursaries. I mean, God, if I could go back in time, I'd be applying for 5 different programs right now. But I'll actually give you a real life example because this is kind of a segue, but it does make some sense. I sometimes kind of joke that I'm a bit of the poster child for lifelong learning because I've changed areas a few times in my life. There is this trajectory that makes sense, trust me, but I'm not gonna bore you with it now. But one of the other things I did throughout my academic career was I took every opportunity I could to travel and learn in different places. So I did, a year abroad in my undergrad. I did a summer away after I finished my master's degree. I did my PhD in one country, but my research was in another. So I went back and forth quite a bit. And I used all of that time and that experience to learn as much as I could about other things too. I learned a bunch of languages, for example. I learned what it's like to live in different countries. Those skills are actually coming back to be so much more useful now as a very fully grown adult. So, and they also give me a very different, I think, perspective on AI. So, for example, I see things like, oh, AI can speak every language now. We don't need language learners. And I look at it and I go, well, I'm sorry, but I'm in Europe, where my second language technically was actually English because I was born in the west of Ireland. So we have Irish there too. And I went to an Irish school. I did a year of my undergrad in Spain. I did my master's in Belgium, and I did my PhD in Canada. Between that, you've got 6 languages. No one is going to be getting rid of those languages. So yes, there might be AI that can do those things. But what's AI for? Maybe AI is for translating. Maybe AI is to make life easier when you're traveling from place to place. But if you want to understand a culture and a civilization and a document, even the way it's written, the nuance, you need to understand the language. And it also gives you inroads to understand the culture because people will be much more open to talking to you and welcoming you into the community if you make the effort to speak their language. So I mentioned that just to say that's an example, I think, for where we can think about where AI is useful and where, as human beings in university, the experience that we want to have. It's really about the bonds you form, the things you're exposed to, the experts you have access to, the funding, the money you have access to. I would say live as much as you possibly can. Try out those tools. Don't be afraid. Don't be worried about them, but get the most out of that 3, 4, 5 years you possibly can, because it's the growth that you gain from in those years that will give you the perspective and will give you that grounding that you need to cope with things like AI.
That's wonderful advice. And it reminds me of a post that you had recently on LinkedIn where you were talking about your experience with starting a company. And you gave the advice that students should all start a company. Say a little bit about this. How might this be? Why is this an ideal time for this kind of project-based learning? Is this the kind of project that we should incorporate in classwork?
So I always think project-based learning is a great idea.
Yeah.
I did a little bit of work with a university in Europe a little while ago, and their whole system is switching to project-based learning. And there's a few of them in Europe that do that. There's one in the Netherlands as well. It's not so unusual. So, and with that's part of competency-based education, assessing as you go, learning as process rather than product. So there's all kinds of great examples of people experimenting out there. So Yes, in short. Now, I was being a bit glib, or maybe just kind of exaggerating a bit for the sake of the LinkedIn saying every student has to create a company. But what I was getting with that was that I was, first of all, learning lots of real life skills. So I had to do things like, create my website, deal with the accountancy side, decide what my marketing was going to be, decide how I was going to talk about what I was offering. Who am I? How do I want to frame it? But also some really mundane things, like filling out forms for the registry office and making sure that I've filed this and filed that. But what was really enlightening for me was not just those things that I learned to do that broadened my perspective. What it really showed me was how important and useful AI is now. So, for example, if I need, now again, with your hand up saying, I know that there are lawyers that will do this better than me, but to do some first draft checking, contracts, legal documents, feedback on things that you might receive from maybe someone who's gotten in touch, all things that I learned myself as someone who was setting up a business that had I just been in the classroom, I never would have had to do. And it really hit me right there, the gap between education and industry. And I thought, wow, that is why students need to do something like set up a company and run that company for a week or two and literally do everything that I had to do, because it's not artificial anymore. It's not theoretical. And then they really see the power of AI to help them and to make them more efficient. We always hear about it, but also to do that thing that we talk about, that is augmenting their own intelligence, saving them time, but also, frankly, allowing them to do so much more. I found it really exciting, really eye-opening. And so everyone who's watching this, go and make your own company and get back to me in a fortnight and tell me everything you've learned.
That's great.
I wonder, how do you see, you've had conversations, with a lot of leaders in education, right, around the world, and, in different roles in the university, university leaders, people working in education departments. What are just maybe a few different things you hear, right? Sometimes I show up at a place and, I'm not surprised, right? Like I hear common things. Other times I'm a little surprised by what somebody says. What are maybe a few things, across those, a couple of things that have surprised you and just a couple of things you commonly hear?
So the first thing that surprised me, that really got me thinking, two things actually. So one of the first talks I gave online was in 2020, late September 2023, for a university in South Africa in September. And it was part of their teaching and learning conference. And I believe it was the vice rector or the provost, I'm not sure who, but it was a high level leader at the university who did the opening blurb. She talked for 10, 15 minutes and she gave a really great opening talk. But the comment that really struck me was, she said, we are worried that we are going to be colonized again, recolonized with AI here in Africa. So that was the first thing, that we need to be very aware of this from a global perspective, particularly global South, global majority, not just this, primarily white, I have to say, North American, often male, very Silicon Valley dominated, machine from that area. And that's why I'm always talking about things from other parts of the world as well, because we have to remember this is a global phenomenon. It's not just a Western North America phenomenon. The other thing that really struck me was when I met a group of delegates from Brazil. I met them first in Madrid. I went to go give a talk for a university in Madrid, where they had a huge delegation of government people coming over from Brazil, representing each of the different federal districts. So I was talking about data privacy and how in the UK and Ireland, and often a lot of Western Europe, were very worried about student privacy and protecting that. And they said, and again, I'm not going to, this was not the whole group, but this was just kind of one person that, as an aside, later said, we're not actually as worried about that. We just want to know what it costs. And I thought, oh my goodness, that's really interesting. Now, that's not to say that all of Brazil is not worried about ethics and privacy. Please don't misunderstand me. But what I meant was, or what I took from that was, depending on your geographical location, you have a different context. And again, this is the word I keep coming back to now. In Ireland, we have a context where we have a small national language that is basically too small to create a large language model easily. We have minority languages in Europe we want to protect, where we have the same issue. In South Africa, they're worried about recolonization. In Brazil, they're worried about the cost, because they're a gigantic country and they've got an incredible ecosystem of online and digital learning that they're embarking on. We've been working on for years. but again, everyone's challenges are different. So those are two things that have surprised me and really, I think, opened my eyes quite a bit.
That's fascinating, especially for those of us, especially in the first world, to not recognize the difference in context and how that will change the perspective someone might have. What a great example to bring back into our classrooms to be able to have a better understanding of how the technology is not the same for everybody. It's not going to interface with everyone the same.
Exactly.
Kind of ties into something I wanted to ask a bit about when we consider maybe a little further down the road, we consider some of the societal impacts of AI. If it does play out and does continue to develop as it is, and you get to a scenario where it becomes very advanced, and you have leaders like Sam Altman, who has said that without proper guidance or leadership, you could end up with a society where everyday people could find themselves without a sense of worth or need. Want to talk about how do we approach this as we think about this with our students? How do we prepare our students to consider that? Maybe that's not really the conclusion we should be drawing, that we'll get to that type of society, even with the acceleration of AI that is being played out. But how do we broach that subject? How do we prepare our students to consider that and really prepare them for the potential of that world?
So I just have to preface it by saying I have great respect for what these AI CEOs have done technically. I sometimes question the missives that they put out there.
Yeah.
I find some of them alarmingly isolated and insulated from the reality of life. I remember reading Sam Altman's blog, the one where he introduced, I think it was the intelligence age, and he was saying that soon we would see today's world like the 19th century lamplighter. It was some kind of a comparison, basically saying how it would be back kind of days of yore, and we were going to transform everything, and we'd soon, and as you alluded to there, and we'll soon have so much free time we won't know where we'll get our self-worth from, because we'll be basking in this radical abundance. They all love to use that phrase as well. I've heard it from Sam Altman, obviously, but Demis Hassabis drops it quite a bit. Dario Amodei last year wrote a piece called Machines of Loving Grace. I'm sure you guys have both read it, which I thought was really interesting. I find Dario Amodei one of the more thoughtful of some of those. And I have great respect for Demis Hassabis too, actually, to be honest with you. I think what they're doing is phenomenal. But they're all technically brilliant. I sometimes wonder about their messaging. I feel like they all need a PR person who's going to stand there and control what they say in public. Because this worry about the future, I don't think our concern is actually going to be that we're all going to be basking in radical abundance. I think we can already see that for the next 10 or 20, maybe even 30 years, we are looking at what the OECD has described instead in a fairly dramatic visual, a big bubble in one of their charts as social pain. Because this shift is happening so much more quickly than the first revolution, industrial revolution, or the second or the third, that we don't have the time to adjust and basically mitigate that social pain. And that it's going to be very, very difficult to adapt fast enough to make sure that we all live well and we live happily and we have income, etc. So I'm a visiting prof at LSE, which is the University for the Social Sciences. And we have a lot of conversations about, the fact that it's fine to talk about how we'll all live happily ever after. But what about that messy in between part? What about the social pain bubble that's 20 years ahead of us? And I don't see enough being talked about in terms of, I see the what, I don't see the how. And I always want those leaders in AI, those AI CEOs to come back and go, okay, great. If you envision a paradise, show me the policy to get there. So I think that's the first thing, that there's a gap and there's a little bit of a messaging problem, with all due respect, because I also agree that they are technically quite brilliant people and I have great respect for what they do. But in terms of the existential worries for students, then, we definitely don't want to be saying to them things like, are you worried about what you'll do when we all have so much money and free time? No, that's not our issue. What we need to be doing is, what are you going to do in 5 years from now when you graduate, or 3 years from now? What is the job of the future, given that we don't even know what it looks like yet? What are the skills and the competencies and the knowledge and the self-development you need to do as a human to be able to adapt and ride the wave that is going to keep on churning for the next decade or two? And that's where I always actually come back to the humanities, my home base, which is that, people used to tell everyone to learn to code. Well, that's great. Now we have Claude Code, and I think we've learned that tough lesson. What do you need in this world? It's such a cliche to say it, but we all know it now. The World Economic Forum said it, the OECD said it, the EU said it, everyone has said it. We need adaptability, flexibility, that kind of critical thinking mindset, etc. So all of those things, how do you develop them? You have tough discussions. You have the kind of the discussions that educators are having, but you also learn what the technology does and you make sure you don't fall behind. I think actually that has to be the other side. So keep that higher ed basis. I love that core, that humanities core is what's made me who I am as a thinker and a professor and a writer. And I don't write with AI for that reason, but I also am very, very aware of the fact that if I don't know what Claude code does, if I don't try vibe coding, if I don't create my own custom bots, who am I to talk about what the opportunities or the challenges of AI? I don't have any credibility if I don't do it myself. So that's what I'd like. I'd like both sides. Sorry, that's a very, very long answer. I'm terrible at short answers, and I might have even gone off topic, but hopefully that's an answer of sorts.
No, I love the answer. One of the things that, hit me when this all came out, and, so many, especially professors, are like, oh, we don't have time. This is a new thing. It's like, a lot of people, they spend a lot of their life in education, right? Like people with PhDs, I mean, they're generally in school, like, ages 25, 26 to 30 years old, right? They've spent so much of their lives reading about all these ideas, like having all these discussions. I think beyond the technical, using the tools, people just intellectually have so much to contribute. And because I just think they feel a little bit overwhelmed. They're not sure how to manage the students using the AI, which to me just seems, in the grand scheme of things, like not all that important. I think they're kind of barriers, like they're not coming out and sharing what they have, right? And you can talk about it intellectually. You talked about with the students, even just lived experience, right? If you're not in higher education, or maybe you didn't pursue higher education, you have a lot of valuable experience to contribute. And I just think that more people need to be involved in the conversation about this. So it's not, oh, well, it's either machines of loving grace or, it's like a dystopian world, because I think everyone says that, these next years are going to be hard, and we're going to have challenges. And
now that you've talked a bit about, some steps that faculty can take, you've talked a bit about how students can frame where they're going to be going in the next few years, even though we don't know what that world is going to look like entirely. I want to ask you to take out your crystal ball and tell us if things progress as they are, how do you see higher ed in 5 years? What will it look like in 5 years? And then maybe what can we aspire to if that's not quite where we want to be?
So first of all, 5 years is not long in higher ed time, because what is it now, 2025? We're already 3 years in, and we're still in many areas having the same discussions we had in November 2022. So hopefully we will have moved on. That's the first thing. On the one hand, there is no doubt that the technology is going to be absolutely so much further advanced in 5 years than it is now. And I think right now we're at a very important moment where we are at this juncture, where we're being offered things like study tools, learning guides, wrapper tools, etc., which again serve a purpose of sorts. But do they teach people how to use the technology? Not really. Do they teach people how to change with the times? Not really. I want something that will enable people to do that, so that in 5 years' time, they know how to manage a team of agents for the job that they're about to go to in pharma or bioscience or whatever. I want them to understand how to program and work with robotics and advanced manufacturing. I want them to understand world models, so that if they are doing, let's say, project-based learning or experiential learning, they can do things like have their students create and occupy, inhabit simulations for their field, for like medical health or med tech. I want them to understand that they can literally generate worlds for their students. So like those are the things that are, I think 5 years from now, the tech is going to be mature enough that those will be opportunities. But if people don't start learning about it now, that 5 years is going to creep up, and we're maybe still going to be talking about chatbots while the rest of the world will have gone to that next phase. So again, it's balance. And I really just want to say before we close, I appreciate how difficult this is. I appreciate the time poverty. I have wanted to write the paper that I just published today for 8 months. And I did exactly what you mentioned, Stefan. I went back and forth between trying to keep up with everything, going out, giving talks, doing that kind of day-to-day stuff that I'm doing, but at the same time, trying to find space in my brain to digest and write it down so that I can share it in a way that's going to help people. And it's very difficult to find that balance. And if it's difficult for me, I can only imagine how difficult it is for someone who's teaching 4 or 5 courses. So serious respect to the people who are trying to do that. I really hope that the leaders will make the space for them to do that. I really hope that happens. And I would love to see every college and university out there with a makerspace of some sort, a place to play, a place to learn, and some kind of a competitive or showcase place where we can show off what we're doing with those tools in our course designs in 5 years from now.
That is fantastic. Thank you so much for the time and the conversation. So much for us to think about. Tell us, where can anybody watching this find you to be able to read more about your work?
You can find me if you can spell my name, you're already there. So it's Mairéad Pratschke, all one word.com. I'm not going to spell it out for you, but maireadpratschke.com is my website. So you can find me there very easily. I'm also on LinkedIn. Mairéad Pratschke is on LinkedIn. And again, I think I'm probably the only one in the world. So if you spell it right, you're going to find me.
Thanks so much. And
Thank
we
you
look
so
forward to
much.
following your work.
Thanks, guys.